Within the landscape of modern shonen manga, protagonists are traditionally constructed as aspirational figures, characters whose latent talent, emotional intensity, or moral purity positions them for exceptional growth. Even when initially weak, such figures typically possess a concealed advantage, unique lineage, extraordinary resilience, or a singular power awaiting activation. World Trigger, authored by Daisuke Ashihara, deliberately rejects this narrative convention through the character of Osamu Mikumo. Osamu Mikumo is not merely weak in a superficial or temporary sense. He lacks exceptional Trion capacity, physical prowess, intuitive combat instincts, and natural charisma. More importantly, he is fully aware of these deficiencies. This self-awareness is not portrayed as a character flaw to be overcome, but rather as a defining structural feature of his identity. Osamu does not exist within the story as a hero in waiting, he exists as an ethically burdened individual attempting to act correctly in a system that rewards power and efficiency. This distinction is critical. Osamu Mikumo represents a rare case in shonen manga, a protagonist whose narrative function is not to embody potential greatness, but to interrogate the moral meaning of action under constraint. His arc is not about transcendence, but about consistency, about refusing to abandon responsibility, even when doing so would be rational, efficient, or self-preserving. This first section establishes the foundational premise of Osamu Mikumo's character, that his weakness is not incidental, but architecturally essential. His lack of talent is not a temporary obstacle, but a permanent condition that shapes his psychology, ethics, and leadership style. To understand Osamu, one must therefore move beyond power scaling and instead examine the philosophical and psychological logic that governs his decisions. The narrative environment of World Trigger. To appreciate Osamu Mikumo's role, it is necessary to briefly contextualize the world he inhabits. World Trigger is structured around an institutional framework, Border, tasked with defending Earth from interdimensional threats known as neighbors. Border operates through explicit hierarchies, rank-based evaluations, and quantifiable metrics of performance. Agents are assessed not by abstract ideals, but by measurable contribution, combat efficiency, survival rates, strategic impact. This environment is crucial because it is inherently hostile to individuals like Osamu. Border is not a system that rewards moral intent, it rewards results. It is therefore a world in which ethical responsibility and personal limitation frequently collide. Unlike many shonen settings where institutions are either corrupt or easily transcended by individual brilliance, Border is largely rational, functional, and meritocratic. It does not persecute Osamu, it simply does not accommodate him. This creates a subtle but persistent tension. Osamu's moral impulses are valid, but they are not structurally supported. Thus, Osamu's struggle is not against villainy or injustice per se, but against the friction between ethical obligation and systemic reality. This is a markedly adult conflict, more closely aligned with real-world professional and moral dilemmas than with adolescent power fantasies. Osamu Mikumo, a profile of ordinary limitation. Osamu Mikumo's defining traits can be summarized succinctly: low Trion capacity, average intelligence, minimal combat aptitude, and an absence of exceptional instincts. None of these characteristics are exaggerated for comedic effect. They are presented matter-of-factly. In many cases, they are quantified and compared directly to those of other agents, reinforcing the narrative's commitment to realism. What distinguishes Osamu is not the presence of hidden potential, but the absence of illusion. He does not believe himself to be special. He does not expect the world to bend around his intentions. He understands with unsettling clarity that his decisions carry consequences he may not be able to control or mitigate. This awareness produces a psychological burden that most protagonists are spared. Osamu cannot rely on instinct or power to compensate for mistakes. Every decision is therefore weighted, deliberated, and morally evaluated. This results in a cognitive style characterized by caution, self-criticism, and strategic foresight. Importantly, Osamu's self-assessment is accurate. He does not underestimate himself out of insecurity, nor does he overestimate himself out of pride. His self-knowledge is one of his most reliable attributes, even when it causes him emotional moral responsibility as identity, not performance. Central to Osamu Mikumo's characterization is his understanding of moral responsibility as an internal commitment rather than an external performance. This is encapsulated in his statement, "If I ran away from what I think I should do even once, then surely I'd end up running away when it matters most. I know the kind of person I am. I'm not doing it for others. I do it for myself." This quote reveals several critical aspects of his psychology. First, Osamu frames morality as habit-forming. Ethical failure is not an isolated event, but a precedent that reshapes future behavior. Second, he locates responsibility within self-concept rather than social expectation. His actions are not motivated by recognition, validation, or approval. Most importantly, Osamu understands that identity is constructed through repeated decisions under pressure. His fear is not punishment or failure, but self-erosion, the gradual loss of integrity through rationalized retreat. This fear explains why Osamu is so hard on himself. His self-criticism is not masochistic, it is preventative. He polices his own intentions because he knows that no external authority can do so reliably. Osamu Mikumo exists in deliberate contrast to other central figures in World Trigger. Characters like Yuma Kuga and Yuichi Jin possess extraordinary capabilities that allow them to operate intuitively and adaptively. They are flexible in ways Osamu cannot be. Rather than diminishing Osamu, this contrast sharpens his narrative function. He is not meant to compete with such figures, he is meant to complement them by embodying a different mode of agency. Where others act because they can, Osamu acts because he believes he must. This distinction redefines heroism within the text. Heroism is no longer a function of capacity, but of commitment. Osamu does not save others through strength, he attempts to protect them through judgment, planning, and moral resolve. The psychology of self-awareness. Self-awareness in fictional characters is often portrayed as a transitional state, a moment of insight preceding growth, confidence, or transformation. In World Trigger, however, Osamu Mikumo's self-awareness functions not as a stage but as a permanent psychological infrastructure. It is the mental framework through which he interprets his environment, evaluates his actions, and constrains his impulses. This distinction is essential. Osamu does not gain self-awareness as part of his arc, he begins with it. What changes over time is not the presence of insight, but the weight it carries. As Osamu accumulates experience, failure, and responsibility, his awareness deepens, becoming increasingly burdensome. This produces a form of psychological realism rarely afforded to shonen protagonists, the recognition that knowing oneself accurately does not necessarily make action easier. This section argues that Osamu's defining psychological trait is not weakness, fear, or doubt, but metacognition, the ability to think about his own thinking, to evaluate his competence in real time, and to adjust his behavior accordingly. This metacognitive capacity underpins his strategic development, leadership style, and ethical consistency. Metacognition and accurate self-assessment. Metacognition refers to the capacity to monitor, evaluate, and regulate one's own cognitive processes. In psychological terms, it is the difference between merely thinking and understanding how one thinks. Osamu Mikumo demonstrates a consistently high level of metacognitive awareness, particularly in high-stakes situations. He is acutely aware of his limited try-on capacity, his slower reaction time, his tendency toward rigid thinking under pressure, his vulnerability to emotional bias when others are at risk. Crucially, this awareness is accurate. Osamu does not catastrophize his limitations nor inflate them into excuses. He recognizes precisely what he can and cannot do. This distinguishes him sharply from characters whose self-doubt is rooted in distorted perception rather than factual assessment. Accuracy is the key variable. In psychological literature, self-knowledge becomes maladaptive only when it is inaccurate, when individuals either underestimate their capacity leading to avoidance or overestimate it leading to reckless behavior. Osamu avoids both extremes. His realism is painful, but it is functional. Cognitive load and decision-making under constraint. Osamu's metacognition significantly increases his cognitive load during combat and planning scenarios. While other agents rely on instinct, reflex, or raw power, Osamu must consciously manage multiple variables simultaneously. This cognitive load includes tracking team positioning, anticipating enemy movement, accounting for his own limited contribution, compensating for others' weaknesses, planning contingencies for failure. From a psychological standpoint, this places Osamu at a disadvantage in fast-paced situations. High cognitive load reduces reaction speed and increases fatigue. However, it also enhances strategic foresight. Osamu compensates for his slower execution by improving his pre-planning and situational awareness. Over time, this results in a distinct cognitive profile. Osamu becomes a planner rather than a performer, a coordinator rather than a combatant. His self-awareness does not disappear, it becomes operationalized. The paradox of self-knowledge and self-demand. Knowing oneself accurately often leads to self-compassion. In Osamu's case, it leads to increased self-demand. This paradox is central to his psychology. Because Osamu understands his tendencies, his caution, his fear, his temptation to retreat, he holds himself to a stricter standard. He does not expect perfection, but he demands sincerity. This demand manifests as harsh self-evaluation, but it is not rooted in contempt. Rather, it is rooted in trust. Osamu believes that if he allows himself small ethical failures, they will compound. Thus, his self-criticism functions as a safeguard. It is less about punishment and more about maintenance. Identity in relation to others. Although Osamu frames his actions as not for others, his identity is deeply relational. His sense of responsibility is shaped by the knowledge that his choices affect teammates, civilians, and subordinates. However, he does not derive identity from others' approval. Instead, relationships increase the stakes of his self-concept. He must become someone worthy of trust, even if that trust is not explicitly granted. This distinction prevents his morality from becoming performative. Osamu does not act to be seen as good, he acts to remain someone who can look at himself without evasion. Stability without comfort. Osamu's identity is stable, but it is not comforting. It does not offer reassurance or certainty. Instead, it offers orientation. He knows which actions are unacceptable to him, even if he does not know which actions will succeed. This form of identity stability is psychologically demanding. It requires continuous vigilance and emotional endurance. Osamu does not feel like a hero. He behaves like someone who refuses to abandon responsibility. This distinction again separates him from archetypal protagonists whose identities often provide emotional fuel. Osamu's identity consumes energy rather than generating it. Self-criticism, discipline, and the psychology of growth under constraint. Osamu is undeniably hard on himself. He scrutinizes his failures relentlessly, anticipates his own inadequacy, and rarely grants himself emotional relief. However, this self-criticism does not function as an expression of self-hatred. Rather, it operates as a disciplinary system, regulating behavior in the absence of talent, power, or instinctual advantage. It is a response to structural vulnerability, not an emotional pathology. Understanding this distinction is essential to appreciating why his psychological profile supports growth rather than collapse, why self-compassion alone is insufficient for Osamu. In many narratives, self-compassion is presented as the antidote to self-criticism. While self-compassion is psychologically protective, it assumes a baseline level of competence or security. Osamu does not possess this baseline. Because his margin for error is narrow, emotional comfort alone would be maladaptive. Over-forgiveness would encourage risk-taking that his capabilities cannot support. Osamu's self-criticism functions as a compensatory mechanism, narrowing his decision space to what he can responsibly manage. This does not mean Osamu lacks self-respect. Rather, he prioritizes accuracy over comfort. He accepts emotional discomfort as the cost of responsible action. Responsibility amplifies self-criticism. As Osamu assumes greater leadership responsibility, his self-criticism intensifies rather than diminishes. This is consistent with his identity-based morality. Greater influence demands greater scrutiny. He does not grant himself leniency because he is learning. Instead, he holds himself accountable for the risks imposed on others. This creates a disproportionate psychological burden, particularly given his limited capacity to protect teammates through force. Yet, this burden does not paralyze him. It refines his decision-making. Osamu becomes increasingly cautious, strategic, and anticipatory. Leadership as burden rather than privilege. Osamu does not experience leadership as empowerment. He experiences it as burden. Each additional responsibility amplifies his self-criticism and cognitive load. This perception diverges sharply from narratives in which leadership fulfills personal ambition or self-actualization. Osamu does not seek command, he accepts it because refusal would violate his self-concept. This burdened leadership reinforces his moral credibility. Others observe that Osamu does not enjoy authority, nor does he exploit it. Authority for him is a duty to minimize harm rather than maximize achievement. The quiet authority of responsibility. Osamu Mikumo's leadership challenges the assumption that authority must be grounded in power. By leading through ethical consistency, transparency, and burden-bearing, he establishes a form of authority that is neither glamorous nor absolute, but deeply credible. His leadership does not eliminate risk or guarantee success. It ensures that risk is acknowledged, shared, and borne with seriousness. Strategy without the illusion of control. In action-oriented narratives, strategy is often portrayed as a form of dominance, an intellectual equivalent to physical power that allows a character to outmaneuver opponents decisively. Osamu Mikumo's strategic thinking and world trigger does not conform to this model. His strategies do not guarantee victory, nor do they grant him control over chaotic situations. Instead, Osamu's approach to strategy functions as risk management under constraint. His plans are not designed to overwhelm opponents, but to reduce uncertainty, mitigate harm, and create narrow pathways through which survival or marginal success becomes possible. Strategy as compensation for structural weakness. Osamu's turn towards strategy is not a preference, it is a necessity. Lacking physical power, speed, and Tryon reserves, he cannot afford improvisational combat. Every engagement exposes him to disproportionate risk. Strategy, therefore, becomes a compensatory mechanism. By planning in advance, Osamu attempts to front-load cognitive effort, reducing the demands of real-time execution. This shift from execution to preparation mirrors real-world expertise, development in constrained environments, where success depends less on peak performance and more on minimizing failure modes. Systems thinking over tactical brilliance. Osamu does not display the hallmarks of tactical genius. He does not anticipate every move or exploit obscure loopholes with elegance. Instead, he demonstrates systems thinking, the ability to understand interactions between multiple agents, constraints, and feedback loops. His planning accounts for team composition and comparative strengths, terrain and environmental variables, enemy incentives and information asymmetry, communication limits and timing delays. This systemic approach allows Osamu to construct plans that remain functional even when individual elements fail. Rather than optimizing for best-case scenarios, he plans for degradation. The role of failure in strategic evolution. Osamu's strategic growth is driven by failure rather than success. Each failed plan becomes a data point, refining his understanding of limits. Unlike characters who treat failure as a temporary setback, Osamu integrates failure into his planning assumptions. He begins to expect error, miscalculation, and unforeseen variables. This expectation leads to redundant contingencies, conservative objectives, clear exit conditions. Such strategies may appear cautious or uninspired, but they are adaptive in high-risk environments where survival depends on minimizing irreversible loss. Conclusion: Osamu Mikumo and the ethics of becoming. Osamu Mikumo stands as one of the most conceptually rigorous protagonists in contemporary shonen manga precisely because he refuses the genre's central consolations. He is not rewarded with latent power, narrative immunity, or emotional catharsis. His growth is not marked by transcendence but by accumulation of responsibility, self-knowledge, and moral weight. Across the preceding analysis, Osamu emerges not as a hero defined by capability but as a subject defined by ethical endurance. At the structural level, Osamu's weakness is not a narrative inconvenience to be resolved, but a permanent condition that shapes every aspect of his psychology. His low try-on capacity, limited combat aptitude, and absence of instinctual brilliance function as constraints that strip away heroic shortcuts. What remains is a character forced to confront the fundamental question that power fantasies typically obscure. How should one act when good intentions are insufficient and success is uncertain? Osamu's answer is neither optimism nor resignation, it is responsibility. His defining psychological trait, self-awareness, operates as both strength and burden. Unlike protagonists whose self-doubt is a prelude to confidence, Osamu's metacognition deepens over time, intensifying rather than resolving tension. He understands his limits with unsettling accuracy, and this understanding imposes cognitive and emotional costs that the narrative never trivializes. Yet it is precisely this realism that enables adaptation, discipline, and strategic clarity. Osamu does not misjudge himself and therefore does not mislead others. Central to this self-awareness is Osamu's moral identity, articulated most clearly in his refusal to run away from what he believes he should do. His fear is not failure, punishment, or defeat, but erosion of self-consistency. Identity for Osamu is not aspirational but preservation. Each decision is evaluated not only for outcome, but for what it affirms or corrodes within him. In this way, morality becomes habitual rather than situational, grounded in continuity of character rather than external validation. This identity generates a distinctive form of self-criticism, one that is often misread as insecurity but functions instead as discipline. Osamu is hard on himself not because he despises who he is, but because he understands what is at stake if he allows ethical standards to soften. His self-criticism is constructive, forward-looking, and tethered to agency. It produces growth not by liberating him from discomfort, but by training him to operate within it. He becomes resilient not through confidence but through tolerance. That tolerance enables leadership without power. Osamu's authority does not arise from dominance, charisma, or exceptional ability, but from ethical reliability. He leads by bearing responsibility visibly, by refusing to externalize blame, and by constraining his own decisions before constraining others. Trust, rather than fear or admiration, becomes its primary resource. In a system that measures worth through results, Osamu earns legitimacy through seriousness. Strategy for Osamu is not brilliance but survival. His intelligence manifests as systems thinking, contingency planning, and expectation of failure. He does not seek control, he seeks viability. His plans are designed to degrade gracefully, to absorb error rather than deny it. Even here, ethics impose limits. He refuses strategies that externalize risk onto others unjustifiably, reinforcing the inseparability of intelligence and responsibility in his character. All of these elements converge in Osamu's form of courage. It is not the courage of confidence, nor the courage of destiny, nor the courage of power. It is existential courage, the willingness to act without assurance, to choose engagement over retreat despite incomplete knowledge and insufficient means. Osamu acts not because he believes he will succeed, but because he believes inaction would make him someone he cannot accept becoming. In this, Osamu Mikumo represents a radical redefinition of heroism within shonen manga. He is not an ideal to be admired from a distance, but a mirror held uncomfortably close. His struggles resemble real-world moral dilemmas more than mythic trials, decisions made under constraint, responsibility assumed without authority, and growth achieved without relief. What World Trigger ultimately offers through Osamu is not a fantasy of empowerment, but a philosophy of becoming. It asks whether courage can exist without confidence, whether leadership can exist without power, and whether growth can occur without transcendence. Through Osamu Mikumo, the answer is quietly, insistently affirmative. He does not become extraordinary. He becomes consistent. And in a world that rewards strength, That consistency is his most subversive achievement. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe.